A notorious regime emerges from the rubble of years of fighting in Afghanistan. Meet the men who helped create the Taliban.
I will tell you why I was joined with the Taliban.
Afghan survivors explain how these Islamic holy warriors first brought hope, then only repression and fear.
Their ideas were wrong, their mission was wrong, their mentality was wrong.
Former spies reveal how the United States helped drive the extremists from power after 9/11. But now the Taliban are back, deadlier than ever.
They think they can destroy Taliban. How can they destroy Taliban? You have to destroy the entire nation.
Spanning almost 30 years, the epic story behind the Taliban is a tale of three men: a one-eyed religious mystic, a legendary military strategist, and the most famous terrorist alive. The rise, the fall, and the rebirth of the Taliban. It's 1989, and the latest battle in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union plays out here in Afghanistan. The Soviet army tries to force communism on the people, but the Afghans, with America's support, fight back. An Afghan rebel named Mullah Omar readies his rocket-propelled grenade and waits for a Soviet convoy to approach. He is the future ruler of Afghanistan. Here, Omar is anonymous, one of thousands of Afghan holy warriors known as the Mujahideen. His only claim to fame is his role as a mullah, or prayer leader, in a mosque in Kandahar. On this day, Mullah Omar has set up an ambitious ambush. Omar later describes his plan to Rahimullah Yousafzai, one of a tiny handful of journalists to ever meet the reclusive future leader.
He said that there was a Soviet army convoy passing on this main road.
As the Soviet convoy approaches, Omar takes aim. His perfect shot levels one of the Soviet vehicles. Omar and his men quickly scatter as the Russians unleash a deadly barrage of return fire. The Mujahideen find momentary refuge in a nearby mosque. Soviet bullets follow them, raking the mosque's walls. But what looks to be the end of Omar's life turns out to be just the beginning of his legend. In the chaos of the firefight, a piece of shrapnel hits Omar in the right eye. His eye is ruined, dangling from its socket, but still Omar continues to fight.
Removed it from the socket and he threw it out and he kept fighting, although there was blood falling on his face.
Omar survives the Russian assault, and soon the streets of southern Afghanistan are buzzing with tall tales about the courage of the 6'6" mullah. Later reports suggest Omar's right eye was probably removed after the fighting in a Pakistani hospital. But the legend is what endures. Omar's destiny is to lead the Taliban, a powerful movement to bring stability to a country ripped apart by war. But instead of the Islamic utopia Omar envisions, the Taliban will turn Afghanistan into the world's worst humanitarian disaster.
It was very hard to control yourself to do not cry. They were beating people always. Every single tree was burned. Every single house was damaged. That's what they were doing with Afghans.
Even this landscape bears the scars from decades of violence. It's hard for many Afghans to remember a time without fighting. But it wasn't always like this. Afghanistan once knew peace. And that's where this tumultuous story begins. It's 1973, and King Zahir Shah rules the country as a modern democracy with free elections, women's rights, and strong international relationships. But later that year, the prosperity starts to unravel. Massive political upheaval is about to set Afghanistan on a ruinous path. First, King Zahir Shah falls in a power struggle and is banished to exile in Rome. Over the next 6 years, new leaders come and go, and Afghanistan's inner turmoil helps make it an inviting target for the most powerful force in the region, the Soviet Union. In 1979, Soviet leaders are seized by Cold War paranoia. The Kremlin fears that the United States could use Afghanistan to threaten the Soviet mainland, according to this former CIA officer.
They had a gross misreading of our intentions and thought that we were going to move into Afghanistan and even place medium-range missiles. KGB reporting was grotesquely off target.
But Soviet Prime Minister Leonid Brezhnev decides that the communists can't afford to lose Afghanistan. In mid-December 1979, Soviet troops start to mobilize for a major operation. Early on Christmas morning, the first Soviet tanks roll across the border of Afghanistan. This imposing terrain has humbled some of history's greatest armies, but the Soviet Union arrives here with all the arrogance befitting a 20th century nuclear-armed superpower. Only a small rebel militia opposes them, a band of simple men like Mullah Omar, armed with little more than their Islamic faith. CIA officers like Michael Scheuer assess this mismatch and make a cold judgment. Afghanistan will end up as a Soviet satellite.
I think initially there was very few people in the American government who didn't believe that the Russians would ultimately prevail, because they had modern guns, because there were so many of them, and because they were brutal.
Within months, the Soviets occupy most of the major cities. But getting into Afghanistan has always been the easy part. It's holding on to the country that has proven historically difficult. For centuries, the Afghan people have resisted occupying forces, from the Greek armies of Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan's Mongols and the imperialist British Empire.
One of the earliest names for Afghanistan is Yagistan. It's called the land of the unruly.
The Afghans are not people you can control or order to do anything.
They do have a strong warrior culture. They do have a strong warrior history.
3 years into the Soviet occupation, the Red Army still can't completely stamp out the resistance. Now, U.S. intelligence officers start to reconsider their opinion of the Afghan Mujahideen.
We began to appreciate the qualities of the Afghans, their ability to absorb punishment, the strength of their faith, their ingenuity in designing ways to kill the Russians. If we armed these people, they would continue to fight the Russians forever.
The war in Afghanistan has the potential to weaken the Soviet Union, both militarily and economically. The CIA looks at the Afghans' fierce Islamic passion and sees a dagger that only needs sharpening. Then, the Mujahideen can make the Soviets bleed. New U.S. President Ronald Reagan decides to intensify a covert CIA program, first begun under Jimmy Carter. America will secretly support the Afghan rebels.
The Congress was virtually united in giving whatever aid they could to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, partly because of the feeling that the Russians were a Goliath kicking in the head of a David, but also because a lot of them wanted revenge for what happened in Vietnam.
In Vietnam, Moscow supported America's adversary, the North Vietnamese. Now the CIA hopes to give the Soviets a long, drawn-out guerrilla conflict of its own, but they'll have to do it quietly. An overt confrontation could trigger World War III,